And there we go, like the lady says. Um, and and also, the idea of this is to keep it relatively informal. So, with please put all your burning questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and get some. And if we're overwhelmed with questions, which is wonderful, and we don't get to answer them all, then we'll endeavour to get back to you on the question. So I'm Richard Spencer. I'm the Director of Sustainability at ICAEW. And we are partners in the We Value Nature project with our good friends at IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and OPLA. And the We Value Nature campaign is really about amplifying the language of natural capital and capital thinking. And today's office hour is about the finance sector. So how do we make natural capital and capital thinking relatable to people in insurance, in asset management, in banking? And we're very fortunate today to have Paul Pritchard, who has a wealth of experience in the financial services sector, and has just told me that he's about to chair the Sustainable Finance Group at BSI, which is fantastic news. Because we need these frameworks. We might have the thinking and we might have the data, but you need the processes in order to make that happen. And I'm going to hand over to you, Paul, to take us through the workshop. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Richard. Okay, thank you. Yeah, just on what Richard said there. So I've basically spent most of my career working in finance, mostly around sustainable finance. So some time in asset management, corporate risk management, and general insurance. And really, I suppose the last few years being very much focused around the climate agenda primarily. And again, I think a number of people on the call will be familiar. There's an initiative called TCFD, Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, which I think is a really big deal. And I think we'll reference directly and obliquely over the next few minutes. So that's me. And I just would say, just before we start, that for somebody who's been in this area for quite a while, it is both heartening and exciting that we've probably seen more activity in finance related to sustainability more broadly, including nature-related issues, in the last 2 years than in the previous 20. So it is an exciting time. And that brings with it challenges, particularly around resourcing and technical capabilities, but it is a really interesting and exciting time at the moment. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to be talking for about 30 minutes. And really, this comes out of the work that Richard was saying that we've been doing for We Value Nature this year, essentially. And that's been engaging with the different parts of the finance sector to really find out to what extent they're engaging with natural capital and nature issues, and how they're thinking about it and what we think the trends might be. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change because I think that offers a really useful route map, I suppose you might say, for getting nature embedded into the whole governance framework of finance, which I think is really important. And it's possibly a bit opaque to people sitting outside the sector. It certainly was when I joined. I'll talk a little bit about that. But there's really two approaches. There's the kind of central governance risk aspects, and then there are much more the impact side of things, which it sort of complements it. As I said, we'll probably aim to have about 30 minutes in a discussion. We'll be joined by Susanna from ICAEW. But again, please submit any questions that you have around that. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm guessing most people, and Richard's really covered this already. So the We Value Nature. It's an EU funded campaign about making valuing nature the new normal. And again, there's a lot of practical support material on the website, case studies and training materials in particular, and it is very closely linked to the work of the Natural Capital Coalition. So if we move on, again, I'm guessing people are hopefully pretty familiar with the idea of natural capital. It's really about stocks and flows. And one of the things that I would say about it, again, coming from the finance sector, it's the sort of language that resonates with the finance sector. Of course, their focus is much more, or historically has been much more around financial capital, but there has been quite a lot of discussion recently about non-financial reporting in particular, looking at other things that relate to the capacity to produce useful outputs of different forms of capital. So I think it fits within that wider discussion and debate that's going on about how can you understand what a business is doing and what its potential future opportunities and risks are. So it fits within that kind of sphere pretty readily. I put biodiversity down in the corner. It's not the same as natural capital, as I'm sure many people on the call know. One of the things that we have found, and I don't know whether it's unique to finance, is that people tend to use the terms interchangeably, and rather than referring to the specific technical definition of biodiversity, the whole of nature, including natural capital, is seen as biodiversity, which isn't, I don't have a particular problem with what people call it, as long as they're doing the work, as long as it doesn't lead to confusion. But if we move on to the next slide, yeah, it's just the definitions there. So it said that the biodiversity is not the same as natural capital. In many ways, natural capital approaches align much more closely to finance sector thinking, but they're probably more familiar with biodiversity as a term. So that's kind of one of the things that we found. So moving on, of course, we have the Natural Capital Protocol. Again, I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with this. It's been around for about 5 years now, or I think slightly over 5 years. I think Richard was actually one of the people who actually launched it. So this is a standard framework for identifying, measuring and valuing both impacts and dependencies around the natural capital. And it's a process that can be applied to any sector. Of course, sectors differ very significantly in terms of their impacts and dependencies. So there is a commitment as well to develop sector-based guidance. And if on the next slide, I think there is actually a supplement that looks at connecting finance and natural capital. And I suppose thinking about finance as something that underpins, sits behind the whole of the economic system, it's exactly the same for natural capital. So you have entities and societies both with impacts and dependencies on natural capital. Sitting behind that is the finance sector. So the risks that are and impacts that are associated with the organization ultimately become the risks and opportunities and impacts associated for the finance sector. That one section remove, I think, has historically meant that maybe they don't feel quite so closely in control of impacts, but that's definitely changing very quickly. And so we've seen it happen already to a large degree in climate. And I think nature and natural capital is a little bit behind it in many ways, but it's actually coming through pretty quickly on that. So the next slide is again something that I think will be pretty familiar. This is the material that we kind of use for our finance sector webinars, introducing people to some of the kind of authoritative sources of information. So we use the IPBS, and one of the reasons that kind of resonates, I would say, is because it parallels a position that people understand that the IPCC has in terms of climate. And of course, we have seen in the last few months really positive that the IPCC and the IPBES have actually got together and recognized that the issues are interconnected, and you can't deal with one issue without looking at the other, or one set of issues without looking at the other. And yeah, the OEC are now saying that there's no way that you can deal with things without addressing nature, things like the pandemic. And of course, we're in the middle of a huge year, a huge time for nature biodiversity with the COP running through into next year as well as the upcoming climate conference. So if we move on, something that comes up quite a lot and people ask about is what impact COVID's had on this agenda. And it's been really interesting. I guess a number of us were quite concerned that finance might divert its attention elsewhere, if I put it diplomatically, because of the pandemic. I think in sustainability more broadly here, that certainly hasn't happened. And I think we've actually seen increasing interest and commitment to sustainability. And I think also as well, the sort of values-based approach that people are starting to question their own organizations, and what are we here for? We're not just here to provide loans, we're here to provide a service to society, or whatever else. So I think there's an element of that values type thinking as well, feeding through into finance. In terms of the actual connection, again, I assume a lot of you are kind of familiar with this as well, that there is a very strong link between COVID, particularly and nature-related issues and impact, particularly around the land use change and humans living in closer proximity and making use of wild animals, the zoonotic diseases, the increase in those. So there is that, but there's also the the OECD has said that this actually needs to be addressed. Biodiversity needs to be addressed in order to deal with, avoid the next pandemic as well. So there is that, all connections here. And of course, like I've been saying on the next slide, there's also a connection between nature and climate change. So the idea, if we go beyond the tipping point, we essentially get irreversible changes, and nature, which helps to mitigate against some of the impacts associated with anthropogenic climate change, lose that capacity, and it's basically irreversible. I suppose that the commonest issue that's discussed within finance in this context is around deforestation, and news such as the areas of the Amazon becoming net carbon emitters rather than sequestration, that certainly got a lot of attention. And something that I do hear quite a bit is that about healthy ecosystems essentially being nature's insurance, which of course plays well to that audience as well, providing resilience against shocks and also against chronic change as well. Well, the main things I wanted to talk about quickly here is the TCFD, the climate-related financial disclosures, which is probably the first major sustainability initiative that's actually come from within the sector. This has come from the kind of global governance framework of finance. It's very risk focused, it's very financial risk focused, but it is fundamental to the sector and cuts across the sector in requiring them to look at the risks and opportunities associated with climate change. And to do that, they obviously need to look at the organizations in which they to lend to, invest in, and insure. It's not quite there yet, but I think most organizations will see a much more significant challenge from their finance sector stakeholders going forward. Certainly if we get, as I'm hoping we get, a robust TCFD process in place. Developing on from that, there is the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which is following, as far as we can tell, a broadly similar kind of approach. And again, this is likely to be something that's driven within the regulatory framework for the finance sector, not necessarily in terms of being mandatory, although I think that is quite likely, but in terms of being picked up by the international, global and national regulators and promoted the requirements there, which is the really important route. It means it affects all the players in the system rather than being picked up by somebody who wants to promote their own particular agenda around this place. And there is quite a lot of the finance sector that is fairly quiet, but actually if you get something in the governance framework, that drives action across the whole sector. So I think it's really important like that. So on the next slide, this is a little bit about this sort of framework. So this is the graphic on the left is something that's come from the Institute for Sustainability Leadership in Cambridge, and they've produced a handbook on nature-related risks for finance sector institutions. And this very, very closely follows the sort of thinking that we're seeing for climate and around TCFD. So this is emphasizing the different types of risk that were put forward in TCFD, physical as in the physical impacts in climates, that sort of flood and extreme weather and everything, but also transition related risks, which are around basically policy, regulatory initiatives, market sentiment and things like that, and tend to be nearer term. So it's getting the kind of existing mindset around climate, thinking about nature in the same way. And as this also emphasizes, you see at the bottom, there are also feedback loops. It's not just the impact of the organization's operations on the bank or insurer or investor. By their actions, there is a feedback loop. If insurance for a certain activity or in a certain location becomes more difficult, or banks won't lend to a certain type of operation or whatever else, that has a really strong feedback effect and can be a force for good, obviously. The initiative that's covered on the right-hand side of the graphic there is the NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System, a really important grouping. And this is of banks, national banks, international regulators, really important players coming together and drafting guidance and really setting the scene for the national regulators to implement this. And they've done some really good guidance on climate, and they're just starting to get their act together around biodiversity, as they call it. It's linked to financial stability because they see climate and nature as posing fundamental threats to the financial system. So that's that kind of where they're coming from. This could be a huge risk for the whole sector, so we need to think about it. And again, it came out a couple of months ago, very much over, this is an area that we're going to explore more. So I'd anticipate climate-like guidance coming from the NGFS and feeding through into the national regulators like the Bank of England in England and the various other national banks as well. Some national banks are ahead. The Dutch National Bank is doing some really good work, but there's probably not too much if we look globally around that beyond those. So on the next slide, it's probably the other route by which the finance sector gets involved. And this is probably more visible to people. And the investment community have probably led most of the activity for quite a long time around climate and also around natural capital and nature. And this is impact focused typically. So it's looking at what organizations are doing or what their impacts will have. So it's complementary to the risk approach. And it's sort of if we think of the non-financial materiality, it's about issues that are important, not always necessarily financially important, but issues that are important to stakeholders. That could be NGOs, it could be customers, could be other people as well. And if you take something, the principles for responsible investment, been quite active in this space, and they've indicated the sorts of actions that they expect investors in this case, but I think it would also apply to banks and insurers as well. So looking and increasing support for sectors that are either improving the situation or less impactful. And I think particularly important, the engaging the organizations directly and saying, what are you doing? Reassure us that this isn't a risk and that you're reducing your impact. That's already happening quite a lot around climate, but I don't think is too widespread on nature. And also looking at policy as well, and working with others like the PRI to actually improve disclosures and improve general set of practice. The investment world is slightly different, or places a slightly greater emphasis on third-party data providers. So there is the kind of ESG world and the ESG questionnaires that a number of organizations will be receiving, and they will be getting questions around nature and biodiversity if they aren't already. They tend to be slightly different, and I know some people sort of say, here's another one, it's different and whatever else. I think there will be convergence around there, but you get the kind of the dual challenge from the probably the investment community coming in one side and saying, what are you doing, what are your impacts, and what do you know, what's the public position that you have. But then there's also the risk issue behind it. Is what you're doing posing a financial risk to the bank or the insurer, whatever else? The other side, of course, is that this is being increasingly seen as a huge opportunity for finance. So perhaps most visibly through things like green sustainability bonds, blue bonds more recently, but also things like sustainability linked loans as well, and insurance-based solutions as well, things like parametric insurance. So what's been really helpful there has been things like or some of the challenges for the finance sector is there's not necessarily deep understanding of nature-related issues. So they're kind of looking for standards that they feel could provide the basis for them to invest. So things like the standard on the IUCN standard on nature-based solutions, really helpful for them, saying, okay, if it complies with this standard, then it's probably investable as well. So, and again, my own background in general insurance, looking at things, particularly around the marine environment here, and thinking there's an awful lot that can be done around improving resilience at the same time as achieving restoration as well. So, okay, if we move on to the next slide, what sort of metrics and tools have been used in the sector? I suppose the one that I hear most about, and it is linked to a natural capital approach, is Encore. And one of the reasons that I think this is popular is because it's easy to use, and also it's amenable to a portfolio approach. So while there are finance sector organizations with relatively small number of people that they invest in, the impact investors, people like that, or private equity, relatively small number. Once you start move over to people like the retail banks, then you're talking about millions of customers. So if you're looking at things like credit risk or insurance risk, they need to look at millions of cases, and it's really, really challenging to look at all of them. They need somewhere prioritizing and looking at it. So Encore, I think, really helps in that way, in providing sort of highlighting sectors, particular sectors and particular geographic areas that would be of concern. In parallel with that, there are some efforts by some advanced organizations, I would say a lot in the Netherlands and France in particular, in developing specific measures that apply to the finance sector. And in some cases, they're focused purely on biodiversity and either the sort of the mean species abundance or the disappeared fraction, potentially disappeared fraction approaches. So the BFFI is a good one. Again, it's gaining support, and that's looking at quantitative measures, that the sorts of things that the people would like to do to compare organizations, and to also look at things like transition planning. So you're here now, but how do we move you to somewhere better over the future? And again, a number of you may know that there are a number of platforms that actually look at comparing the various measurements approaches. I do hear quite a lot about difficulties with data for finance people. I'm not massively convinced that that is the core issue. I think the core issue is the level of technical skills that the people have. And again, personally, I'm looking at it and thinking you don't necessarily need to have a massive understanding of every aspect of biodiversity to take reasonable action that's moving you in the right direction. But you know, that's some would argue with me on that. And I suppose if we move on to the next slide, I'm just looking to see. Again, talking about portfolio action, what does that actually mean for sectors? Well, I think pretty sure it would mean that certain sectors are targeted. To a degree, that's happened already, in that a lot of the major institutions have already been engaged around commodities, so be soy and palm oil and deforestation. So they will tend to have policies and programs supporting that around those particular commodities. What they might not necessarily have, again, beyond a few really good exceptions, would be looking at the overall impacts that their portfolio has on nature. So they tend to be highlighted around sort of key commodity type issues. This was something that came out a couple of months ago from the UNEP, from the finance sector initiative, and it's really looking at the highest impact and dependency sectors as a guide for banks, saying basically focus your activity in these areas and start working out what people in their case who you're lending money to in these sectors, and where are they operating and what are they doing? Do they understand these issues, and have they got plans in place to deal with it? The science-based targets for nature, I think, will also be really important. And one of the reasons that I think that resonates is that it does take this value chain approach, that it looks in a way that fits with the way that the finance sector thinks about it. It's not our own owned impacts, although they can be significant and should be dealt with. It's very much about who's our money financing, and not just them, but their whole value chain to their customers and to their suppliers as well. And that comes through very strongly in the climate related work to TCFD. Okay, you might be fine, whatever fine means in terms of risk, but is there something in your value chain, either your suppliers that have particular issues or risks, or indeed, you know, is your market going to change? Are people going to stop buying what you want or insist on you doing certain things? So I think that value chain approach, as within the science-based targets for nature, is likely to resonate really strongly. I just put at the bottom that initiatives, sort of collaborative initiatives, which I think are going to be really significant, because there is still a pretty low level of technical expertise, if I can say the word properly, and practical experience with dealing with this. So I think collaborations like the Finance for Biodiversity pledge are really important in getting knowledge across the sector and getting sector specific understanding around these things. So just to wrap up before we go to the Q&A, I think we've got Susanna coming in for the Q&A. I'll just say that I think there is likely to be a first reaction from a number in the finance sector to exclude certain activities. This will be the parallel to the divestment in the investment world. So we don't fully understand, and certainly in insurance, if they don't fully understand a risk associated with a client, their first reaction is to say, we don't necessarily want to be involved in that. We don't want to offer cover, or we don't want to lend money to, which of course is an enormous lever, not always the best lever, but it's an enormous lever. So I think that's probably likely to happen in quite a few cases. I think then as it matures a little bit more, it will be more about engagement and saying, okay, these sectors need to change, and how can we be assured that they're changing? I think that's more challenging to understand what needs happening there, rather than saying we're just not going to underwrite activities in sector X, but hopefully that will happen. I think it's not quite there yet, outside, again, a few exceptions. And that is really noticeable that there are one or two finance sector players that are really, really good, and there are an awful lot that aren't quite so good, if I put it politely like that. And with that, I'll leave it. And sorry, Suzanne, I didn't mean to delay you coming in, but hopefully we've been, or you've got some questions, or people have been coming in with some questions about that.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. This was really informative, and I really hope that everyone had that basic understanding that would help them sort of think about this seriously and find the necessary links. Just a way of introduction, I'm Susanna Sheff, and I'm Technical Manager in ICAW. I run our banking and insurance committees, and I joined the We Value Nature project to ensure that the natural capital thinking and natural capital protocol and its finance sector supplement finds its way into financial services organizations. My particular mission in this has been always to move this into risk management and finance and out of sustainability and CSR especially. So with this, Paul and I have been working on a training material that he has been developing specifically for financial services institutions, banks, insurance, and investment managers. We also run a few workshops specifically for the sectors, which was very enlightening, and also a couple for individual organizations. These were mostly, well, I wouldn't even call them workshops, they're more like focus groups, which I think has been particularly useful for these organizations. But the interest is still, I suppose, because we are slightly in an echo chamber, and we are very excited and can see the necessary effort in this work. It's still not quite there. So, Paul, what do you think? How could we get more of a buy-in in these institutions?
I think it's happening anyway. So I mean, the in talking to finance, both in this work and sort of more broadly, clearly a lot more organizations are starting to think about natural capital and nature related issues. and eventually the TNFD, Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, I think will drive it. I think the challenge is, or the opportunity is that to try, exactly like you said, is to try and speak the language as far as possible and try and get it into the core framework. So when things come through the regulators in a UK context, if it comes through the PRA or the FCA, which are the kind of, along with the Bank of England, the main regulators, when it comes through them, the whole sector moves. So the Bank of England is doing climate stress at the moment. It's moving, like that's for the larger ones, but it's moving everyone there. They take it really seriously. It's just no argument, it happens. I think when you approach it as we're telling the sector it's really important from outside, that's a different message. And clearly, they need to listen to their customers and their investors who are asking for more. But you've probably got to get both. And I think it's been in the kind of structural stuff, the governance stuff, which has been the area that's not been so good, and I think could do with improvement overall.
Yes, and I suppose also it works within the individual sectors. What I mean by this is, it was a very interesting conclusion we drew from the workshops, that banks and insurance companies really think about nature-related risks, while asset managers really think about opportunities. And you can see this, all the various funds being put together, packaged and sold to investors.
Absolutely. And I think, the finance or financial services is very broad, and they have very different attitudes towards risk. And if you take something like an insurance company, that's absolutely at the core of what they do, and to a large degree banks as well. So what they think about, how does this manifest as a risk to the insurer or to the bank? Or, is it going to affect the creditworthiness of the people that we're lending money to, or are we going to have a claim against a policy from the policyholder? That's where they start from. So in order to get them fully on board, those messages are really successful. I think the other side, like you said, which it's not completely binary, but the investment community looking and saying, we want to develop portfolios and products that meet the demand that people are increasingly making for. We want to have nature positive portfolios and everything else. So that's great. So it's got to be two sides. The outward looking one, looking at the customers, is obviously really important, but in a way, to get the whole sector moving, I think you need to have both.
You really need to find that sweet spot.
Do you think, Paul, that in a way we've got a huge amount of voluntary action here, but in a sense we're sort of asking the markets to solve the problem that they created, doing the same thing that they've done. And actually, I mean, I'm just completely skeptical about how that would work without some quite well targeted and quite serious regulatory intervention of some sort. So we've found we can impose, the world can after all impose a global business tax if it wants to. Could it not impose a global carbon tax? And actually, until you make those carbon heavy investments unattractive, the people are just going to still invest in.
No, that's absolutely the point. And I think it, clearly where there's a demand from individuals or organizations to have products and services that are sustainability aligned, that's great, and they will move in that sector. But it's like you say, that what would worry me about that alone is that you'll get a bunch of people who say, oh, we see an opportunity here, but there'll probably be an equal number of people who say, actually, we don't need to do this and we can carry on doing these things, or it's too far away or something like that. So I think if we take TCFD and I think TNFD ultimately as well, there's a lot of talk about making it mandatory, which is quite interesting. And I think probably the core thing is for the national regulators to require the people they regulate to do it, rather than the disclosure themselves. You see what I mean? Rather than making all the corporates need to disclose this, if you say to the banks and the insurers, you need to do this as part of the regulatory process, they will do it. And just like you said, one of the core things just doing it now actually is if you're looking at the climate related risks for a bank or an insurer, you're going to say, what if there's $300 a ton carbon tax next week? How does that affect your business? And that needs to happen on the nature side as well, I would say.
Because there have to be consequences, don't there? That because otherwise reporting just becomes this rather beautiful Fabergé egg. It's an end in itself. Because so somebody does TCFD reporting and does a perfect one, and it's absolutely shocking what they reveal. Unless somebody does something as a result of that, it doesn't matter, does it? It's not the act of reporting; it's what happens as a result. And with the kind of prudential regulation, it's got to be the regulators have got to be prepared to take a dim view of a portfolio that looks carbon heavy. I mean, it's that because quite often the narrative is all about the reporting, but you say, to what end? What's going to happen as a result of that? And I mean, investors are rubbish, aren't they? We're much more effective as consumers, aren't we?
I think there is. There's a piece of work done recently in the UK where there's concern about greenwashing, particularly in relation to investment products, and the regulator found that if you put a green badge on it, and you could, people would choose it, even if when you read the text about what it did, it was really not green at all. So the implication being people look for a badge rather than particularly reading or anything else. And I don't know if we're going to change that so that people somehow or other become fantastically interested in the working of investment or insurance or banking products. I suspect that isn't going to happen. But it's like you say, and I suppose if you say if the regulators decide that climate and nature are material risk for the people they regulate, then it makes everyone do it. It makes all of them do it. And all right, the good ones are already looking at it. But if an organization decides it doesn't want to look at it or it's not interested in it, then the regulator will say, so you're not doing anything on this, prove to me that it isn't a material risk. It kind of turns the onus onto the bank or the insurer or the investor to say, you have to prove that it's not significant for however you do that. You still got to look at it and deal with it rather than just say it's not relevant or something. So it's effective disclosure. And I suppose part of the effective disclosure is there are consequences if you don't do a very good one.
And I suppose this is when it's quite important to think it through why it is particularly relevant to look at the financial services industry, because of course, other corporates could do a lot worse than looking at what their financial services providers are required to do, because eventually they are going to be asked to do the same, because banks and insurance companies regulatory reporting, especially on climate and nature related risks, are only going to be as good as the information they get from the customers.
Absolutely.
So it will flow down. And after all, if you're a different corporate, not financial services, but any sort of corporate, but if you can't get insurance for your activities, your business, that's the end of that line. That's the end of the line. So this is eventually how and why financial services is so instrumental in this space. But while we could talk about this for hours, let's not ignore our listeners' questions. So one of the comments, thanks for a great presentation. What needs to be done to build capacity of financial professionals so that they can engage effectively with investing companies on these topics?
Fantastic.
Who, how, and where?
Whoa, okay. That to me is probably the best question that anybody could ask, because I think it's absolutely key to this. And I don't think there's one single answer or one single solution for this. So I suppose, think about it, there are two aspects to it. And I think there's the technical professionals, if I put it, the sustainability professional, the natural capital practitioners, people like that. Of course, they're absolutely core to this whole process. And there needs to be a supply of those, and the finance sector needs to have access to those, and might employ some, but certainly needs to have access. I think in a way, as important is actually building this into the existing structures that exist within financial services, so that accountants actually have an understanding of natural capital, and it's just part of their curriculum, along with climate as well, and all the other stuff that I don't understand. But actually, these two bits should be in there as part of the curriculum, and actuaries and in the business schools, and it is for people like ICAEW to be honest, to be part of this. But I think also the other, there are individual trade bodies reflecting the different parts of finance. Historically, I think have operated quite siloed. So you'd hope they might be able to come together and share there isn't that much expertise around. You hope they might be able to share it a bit. They do have slightly different perspectives, of course. But I think it's certainly the academic institutions, the universities, and the professional bodies, and the trade bodies as well. It's probably a combination of all those together.
I'm sure you would be pleased to hear that we just recently had a discussion around the future of ACA training, particularly in the banking and insurance modules. And the intention is to make all these considerations part business as usual. So not a separate climate or nature related module in it, but make the climate or nature or ESG consideration parts of every single other theme and subject.
Absolutely.
Paul, what do you think listeners and participants in these workshops would find them more useful or found them more useful in understanding the risks or what they could do?
You mean people within finance?
Yeah, and just even when they try to digest this whole training material.
Yeah. Well, I think there is it's been led a lot by the investment community, which is great, and that is very issues and impact focused, and I think that's relatively easy to understand. Deforestation is important, that people are concerned about it, and something needs to happen. I think it's how it fits within existing frameworks, within risk frameworks and everything else, that is a bit more challenging. And I think something like the natural capital journey, if I put it like that, does kind of align with that sort of way of thinking that you see in finance. So that's quite good from that perspective. I do think some of the collaborative things are pretty good, because there are a relatively small number of players who are very good in this. I think the UN stuff is pretty good as well. So I'd certainly recommend looking at things like the learning materials that are on the We Value Nature website, looking at natural capital, and looking at sectoral finance sectoral initiatives, collaboration, because I don't think one organization, is necessarily sitting by itself going to come up with anything great or new, and it's important that it spreads across the sector as well.
And I think it's probably worth pointing out that all these really helpful materials and web pages are absolutely loaded with successful case studies. So it can be done. We're not suggesting that, a bank goes and totally revamps its whole operation in a year or two, but, part by part, element by element.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I think the response, certainly from the insurers, is if they don't understand a risk, is to say, we don't want to underwrite this because we don't understand it and it might come back and bite us. So, encouragement to understand the risk is a really important thing for them. And, it's not necessarily getting really detailed site-specific information. So I don't think saying, or the bank should do a detailed biodiversity survey on every site that they lend money to. That isn't necessarily the way that they think. But if you say, here's a tool for looking at the priority sectors, and here's where you should be focusing your attention, and here's the standard that you should be holding them to, that's kind of much more the sort of space that I think they feel comfortable in. So yeah, if you can say, look, here's a great standard, you hold your customers to this, and that's the sort of language that I think resonates.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think the other interesting things we saw, especially in the focus groups, when we had people from one particular organization, is how important it is to have, first of all, really tone from the top, however much I think this expression is overused, but also a structured approach, because there were large banks where we saw that there were a lot of people doing really useful things on biodiversity, and the approach was the right one. They just didn't really know what they didn't know about each other's work.
It wasn't necessarily seen as a whole, that there's some kind of strategic thing that they need to think about overall and decide these. It's sort of like, oh, we need to do something about soy, or we need to do something about palm oil, and develop a policy, and that's great. But actually looking at it all together, and the interconnection with climate, I think that's sort of probably the area where there could be improvement. And to be honest, I think a lot of organizations are interested in this space, but probably haven't done that much today. There is a bit of national differences, as you might expect. So I think, if we're looking at mentioned the Dutch National Bank, I think the Netherlands and France in particular,
Switzerland as well, quite a few institutions are
look ahead of the game on this space.
And I think it's also very important to build with all the on the experience we've had with the climate work, and really see it as a whole. Because just to move away from nature-related risks and managing them is nice to have. It's just as essential as climate.
If I were someone wanting to integrate nature-related issues, I'd certainly try and make it aligned to whatever is happening with climate, because that's kind of current, that's front of mind for the organization. It's connected to it, or you can't separate it from it, in fact. So I think it's regarding it within that wider sphere, rather than say, here's something completely different that you need to set up a completely different group for. It's actually much better to get the risk function or treasury or whatever involved with it, and look at it that way.
Yeah. And that understanding that connectivity is so vital, isn't it? Because you've got an incomplete picture of climate if you haven't taken on board the biodiversity or even the human side.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, we're almost on the hour now, so I'd just like to thank you, Paul, so much for a wonderful presentation and
Okay.
great conversation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. People seem to be. Nice comments in the chat. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Paul, and goodbye.
Yeah. Can I just encourage everyone to before they go that it is changing very rapidly within finance, and I think if you've had a not receptive audience in the past, I think definitely try again, because I think it is changing. It's changing quickly in that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and what a great point to end on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.